I'm Heather Jemnitsky. I'm an associate professor in cell biology and anatomy in the Cummings School of Medicine. I see a whole bunch of familiar faces on here. So hello to those of you that I know, and really great to meet some new folks that I haven't met before. I'm also the academic lead for teaching and learning research at the Taylor Institute, and I'm an evolutionary biologist. So I study bone development in the School of Medicine. With my other hat on, I teach in the undergraduate medical education program and the Bachelor of Health Sciences in the human gross anatomy programs there. So that's the lens that I bring to this conversation today. And I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Alia Kassam, who can't be here with us today. What I'm gonna work with you on here today is what was a grad course that Alia and I developed a couple of years ago. And we've turned that into a workshop for the purposes of what we're doing here today. So just wanna send out a huge acknowledgement to Alia, who's an associate professor in community health sciences at the Cummings School of Medicine and the research lead for the Office of Postgrad Medical Education. Alia also runs the Wishes Lab, where she studies health professions education from a number of different viewpoints and contexts. So huge thank you to her. None of this would have happened without her participation. All right. So just starting with a land acknowledgement, just like to acknowledge the University of Calgary being located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. City of Calgary, where I am located here today, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And just to, land acknowledgements are, we always read these things, but it's important to understand how the land means something to each and every one of us too when we talk about these things. And so this is a picture from the Assiniboine area that I took a couple of years ago. And of course, this is part of that Treaty 7 region. And just to acknowledge that being out walking around in this beautiful place is an important part of my own existence here. And to be grateful for the fact that I can do that in this place. So the learning objectives for the workshop that were posted that you folks signed up for are these. So we're going to work our way through to define intersectionality as a term and explain the relationship of that concept to equity, diversity, and inclusivity, specifically in the context of health professions education. We're going to describe the components of our own identities. So we're going to do a little bit of work here today, including professional identity, ours, and its relationship to our teaching and learning and professional practice. We're going to consider the importance of professional identity formation in health professions education. And we're going to explain the role of participatory praxis in supporting learners to develop identity and in empowering those learners to drive change. So those were the posted learning objectives, and that all sounds a little bit dry and a little bit lecture-y, and it's really not my intention to sit here and talk at you for 75 minutes. So I want to reframe that for you a little bit. We're going to do something here today. We're going to work together to discuss, to explore, and to maybe come across something that we all can really actually do, something that we can do today, tomorrow, next week, in our various teaching and learning contexts to make a little bit of change. So if we think about it this way, we're going to talk about 3 questions. We're going to talk about how equity, diversity, and inclusivity with a focus on intersectional identities are actually key. That's the argument I want to make to you today, that this is key for health professions education, so for our professional practice in this way, and for the future of the professional practice of the students that we're teaching. We're going to try to answer this question about how we can actually meaningfully create training opportunities around professional identity formation. How can we actually tackle things directly? A lot of times, a lot of criticisms about EDI workshops and other such activities is that it all really sounds great in principle, but how can we actually do something? Today, we're going to actually do something. And so then what I really want to propose to you is that we can initiate some dramatic changes on a small scale, and then we can scale those changes up. So with that in mind, I want to really invite everybody to participate all the way through what we're doing today. If you have questions, thoughts, comments, put them in the chat. My colleague Kyla here will help me keep an eye on the chat as we go along, so please put them there. You can raise your Zoom hand, you can interrupt me however you want to do. I envision this session as sort of a team event. We're all going to kind of work through this stuff, and really happy to make it a chat rather than a lecture, so please don't hesitate. All right. And one final housekeeping thing before we go, I really want to just take a minute to think about what we want to do here today. I know that the workshop objectives have these words identity and intersectionality in them. We are going to do a little bit of that. We're going to talk a little bit about who we are professionally, who we are personally, how that relates to the space in which we do our work. And I'm going to invite folks to share some of that as we work our way through that activity. I'm going to share some of my own too. And just to ask everybody to keep in mind, you know, it's a difficult time. It's a difficult time. Everybody's in a bit of a difficult space, and to just be compassionate with each other, be welcoming and warm. This is a place for us to share, for us to work together. And I'd really like to see us come out with something positive at the end of that. That is my intention. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, concerns before we go forward from here? All right, then let's get started. And as I say, please don't hesitate for 1 second to stop me, interrupt me, raise your hand. All right, so we're going to begin at the beginning of this in some sense in thinking about what is meant by identity and how that relates to disparity. And you're going to see as we go through this that this is going to be, it's going to be kind of a two-pronged thing all the way through. So I'm going to be talking about health professions education as an activity that many of us either engage in, participate in as learners. I realize looking around the Zoom room here that there are folks at different career stages, at different types of engagement with health professions education. So I recognize you all. This is not meant to be specifically for the teachers or specifically for the learners. This is meant to be something that we all do together. That's the principle that's behind this. This is something that we all do together. So we're going to talk about identities and disparities, both inside health professions education as a practice, as well as in the healthcare system as a whole, which is what we're training learners, what we're working towards engaging with. So in the Canadian system, there are a list of what we call protected characteristics. So many of you will be familiar with some or all of these. This is the current list, the current set of legal definitions that exists through the Government of Canada. Protected characteristics are characteristics along which or upon which each and every one of us is legally entitled to protection against discrimination on these grounds. So race, ethnic or national origin, color, religion, age, sex and sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, marital status, family status, genomic traits, disabilities, and convictions for which pardons have been granted or for which records have been suspended. So these are the Canadian legal definitions of protected characteristics in Canada. In other jurisdictions, this language will vary a little bit. Sometimes we use a little bit of different words, but generally speaking, these are those dimensions. Now, what we often don't hear these things referred to actually as protected characteristics, but rather we refer to these as categories in which folks might be equity seeking in different contexts. So when we think about it that direction, these are unfortunately often those aspects along which folks do experience disparities in different aspects of society. So focusing on health care and health education for today. In the healthcare context, we think about our Canadian systems, realizing that these are provincial jurisdictions, but taking a big picture thought to this. We know very well that there are disparities in the provision of care and in healthcare outcomes in Canada that can be directly correlated with these sets of protected characteristics. We have known about this for decades. You'll notice there's a citation at the bottom there. It's an old citation intentionally. That's a 15-year-old citation describing these kinds of problems and how they persist in our system. We know just most recently, even with some of the ways in which challenges around the COVID-19 pandemic have expressed themselves, this is not a new thing. This is something that continues. It's also interesting to note that disparities along these same dimensions in care, in outcomes, in access are correlated with socioeconomic status, and geographic location. in Canada. And one of the specific examples of this that is being talked about a little bit more recently, but again has been known for long periods of time, is folks who live in places that are underserved in terms of healthcare access. So for example, in the north, folks have to travel long distances to access basic services, as an example, maternity services. So we know that these things exist. We know that these disparities are correlated with the protected characteristics as well as the structural factors that exist. So we know it's there. Of course, we know it's there. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. But what is frustrating for folks is that, so if we've known about this for decades, we're a whole lot of smart people. How is that we haven't really managed to make any changes with this? Why does this stuff just continue and continue and continue? It's like kind of a head scratching question, you would think. So then if we look at health professions education itself, at our teaching and learning context, it turns out, and again, not telling anybody anything they don't really know, but it turns out that these things exist inside that teaching system as well. So study number one listed at the bottom there, that's a University of Calgary study, just came out recently, that we know that there are disparities among leaders, among who is leading in academic medicine and provincially in our healthcare system, what the career trajectory of those people has been. This is documented, like I say, 2022 for Alberta, but these data exist or starting to exist across Canada. And then we also know that we have disparities in race, socioeconomic status, and other factors among our medical student population, and that those exist inside the medical student population, as well as relative to the Canadian population at large. So in other words, the Canadian medical student population does not reflect the Canadian population in the way that we might want it to. And that's despite recent efforts to change that, changing the way that we run medical school admissions, the way that we do these other things. And I'm focusing on medical school here as the area with which I'm most familiar, but these problems exist in other health professions education areas as well. So not meaning to exclude anybody here. So we have some recent data on this, but the caveat here too is that the data are only beginning to be collected for this. So that's the other kind of side of this coin, is that we've had hints and warnings and ideas that there has been a problem here for a long period of time. We know the problems in the access side, on the healthcare outcome side. We think that we've got these problems on the inside too, and we're starting to collect those data, and those data are showing that those disparities are there. So we have a two-pronged thing here. We have disparities inside our health professions education system. We have a problem in the leadership of that system. And then we have the same problem in the system itself, in the system we're training these people for. So as I say, this isn't a new problem. And I want to take a minute here to just acknowledge and respect the fact that people are trying to work on this. The fact that we are all sitting here today, we are trying to do something about this. We are starting to talk about these identity axes and how they affect access to care, how they affect education of health professionals. Those conversations are happening. Programs are incorporating specific training that attempts to do something about this. I've just popped the CanMeds logo up here again from my own perspective as a medical educator. The health advocate CanMeds role does include some of this kind of training and some of these kinds of competencies that folks are expected to develop. So we teach people about advocacy. We talk a lot about that. We talk a lot about cultural competency. We are starting to offer training along these lines. EDI training, I put that here sort of as a bucket, given how we've all arrived at this workshop, but these things do exist. But again, there's a little bit of a challenge here, because if you think about these three axes, of training, what is the risk in doing this as straight up training? The risk is this, is that we produce performative responses to these problems rather than authentic learning and growth for our trainees. And what I mean by that, and again, not to disrespect efforts that are going on, there are many efforts going on. The risk is that people learn the language, they learn to say the right things, they learn to, they learn certain key things they think they need to know to understand somebody, but they're not engaging in that personal integration into this challenge. We really want to build empathetic leaders. That's what we're trying to do. And how do we do that? We need to engage people. We need to engage each and every one of us as the humans that we are. So I'm going to propose to you that we have two challenges, and then I'm going to propose to you that we can manage these challenges, both of them, by changing a couple of things about the way we go about things. So the first challenge is this one. How do we understand identity? How do we really understand it? And how do we think about the relationship between identity and societal or social structures as they specifically relate to these disparities in health professions, education, and healthcare delivery? So that's challenge one. How do we actually really understand how people's identity affects their experience, either as learners or as in folks accessing healthcare? And so us as health professional educators, how do we empower our learners to be change makers in an environment as complex as this? Simply put, how do we actually help them do something about it? So I'm going to pause there for a second. Thoughts, questions, ideas? As a health professions educator, I'm well accustomed to sitting here in silence, waiting for thoughts and ideas. So I can make everybody uncomfortable for hours if we need to do that. It's all good. We have plenty of opportunity for chat. I've got a hand raised here. Please go ahead.
Hi, sorry, my name is Cecil. Kind of alluding to everything that you've spoken to. I think there's just so much to already absorb in these first 15 minutes. So thank you so much. I think one thing that struck me was when that challenge that you spoke about around the leadership disparity it's interesting because it almost seems to be accelerated or like highlighted by the fact that the discrepancy with the workforce is often so much more skewed towards, you know, like if we take up the gender roles, right? In many of these healthcare professions, they're skewed to such a big percentage of females, but the leadership then again, like you said, so it like really accentuates that disparity or that challenge to have leadership reflected of the workforce. So I think that that's an interesting thing that we've certainly been dealing with, especially in my profession. But yeah, I look forward to this. And I think one thing that struck me that you just spoke to was that it's that performative response. I think many folks really want to make a change and see a change, but you also sometimes get a sense that it's a checkbox that needs to be checked, and that's so unfortunate. So I think workshops, rather than, like you said, those lectures, is one way to really try and work towards it being less performative and more integrated.
Thanks for that. Yeah, no, you really, that really is a good point. This, and it's one of the real complex things about this is the relationship between what already exists, so the state of the profession, the state of the nature of the workforce, as you said, what students, other learners see as they travel along these pathways, and what they expect will be their own outcomes. There's a sort of a whole shift that needs to happen concurrently in order to kind of engage this a little bit more. So thank you for that. I think we will talk a little bit towards that today. So hopefully that'll work. A couple of folks in the chat here who have said that practicing these concepts important, and to keep doing the work and having the conversations. And so I really appreciate those thoughts as well. We're gonna do that today. We're gonna actually do the work. We're gonna actually practice some concepts and see what we can make of that. So thank you, folks. I apologize for my late response to this. It's off the side of my screen. Somebody has asked that we enable the live transcript for the meeting. I'm going to enable it with the caveat that folks know that these transcript things can be quite challenging. Hopefully this works. For whoever asked for that, if you've got an issue with the live transcription, speak to me afterwards and I will get a closed caption version of this recording to you. All right, so continuing on then. We've pitched a couple of challenges. I mean, they're hard challenges. Not to imply for a second that we're gonna change the world this morning. As much as I would love to change the whole world this morning, we're not gonna be able to do that. But we're gonna see where we can get with this. So let's do a little bit here on the terminology in terms of these words. I've used some specific words in the learning objectives for this because there are some ways we can think about this that help us really get at what we're trying to do here. So starting with this one, with intersectionality. So here's a definition. This definition is from Kimberly Crenshaw's work. Kimberly Crenshaw is a lawyer. This definition was proposed by her. It's not a new term, but this was proposed by her in the early 90s. It is the need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed. So on the surface of that, that may sort of seem not that revolutionary, but this is actually an interesting thing, because when you start thinking about how these things come together, it's an old term. When she pitched this term, she was thinking very specifically about violence against women of color. So we think about that for a second. She was talking about the interplay between race and gender in that particular legal context. So where did that come from, though? That came from a concept, a group of concepts that we refer to as critical theories. And so intersectionality, as sort of specifically defined in this way, is aligned with other critical theories. Now, critical theories are specifically organized around the idea of questioning power structures in society, among other things. Key features of critical theories that apply here is that, first of all, social identity is a socially constructed thing. Now, that's something we could potentially debate for a long period of time here. Exactly how much of your identity is just you and how much of it is relational, how much of it is the context you're in, who you're with, the social structures in which you're working. Critical theory makes the assumption then that social identity is socially constructed. It also makes an assumption or posits that social identities are intersecting and they're multifaceted. Different identities, different places, different times, in the same person. You're not just a thing, you're many things. And I think if we take a second to just think of that very big picture wise, I think we would probably, most of us, agree with that. There's all kinds of things that make you who you are. Key feature of critical theory, though, is that these historically, and I would say currently, marginalized identities that exist. So by marginalized, again, I'm referring to that list of various protected characteristics that tend to be axes on which we are discriminated against. These need to be centered and privileged in order for us to enact change in the world. Those identities have found themselves around the periphery for long periods of history. Getting those identities into the conversation is critical. And then finally, that nothing is going to change without advocacy. Nothing is going to change without thinking about social justice and power structures in the world. But how do we think about those things without thinking about the humans that are experiencing those things? So these four features here of critical theory are the background against which Crenshaw first proposed this idea of intersectionality, that intersecting identities are affected by the social context in which they are experienced. They need to be centered, privileged, and advocated for. Okay, so that was like the mini lecture on intersectionality. Why am I doing this? Here's why I'm doing this, because there's another layer to this. We need to think about social identities and how they interact with other systemic barriers. And we're talking about big social systems like a healthcare system in Canada, in other countries, but here in particular, we need to think about how these other barriers that might exist might amplify the effects of impacts people experience based on identity. These impacts will increase when you have intersecting identities to consider. So you can see how this is layers and layers of complexity that are building on top of this. Then we apply a racist system. We think about that. We think about structurally encoded racist issues in these systems. What about sexism? What about heterosexism? What about poverty and classism? These are all structural components that act as barriers for individuals. Then we overlay identities and intersecting identities, and these things just amplify one another and another. So it really becomes complex. And there's a moment when you walk your way through this list and you think, like, I don't know how am I even ever going to start with this, because there's so many layers on this. Here's an example. Here's a statement for you. Just take a minute to read through that. And so what we have here, this is 2019 data from the United States. Our Canadian data collection system is behind in terms of understanding these things. That is something to remedy. These data from the United States that pregnancy-related mortality ratios for Black women are 4 to 5 times higher than for white women, despite the fact that these deaths, 60% of these deaths are due to preventable causes, and that is not correlated with race. So here we have an example of an intersectional identity being affected in a way different than another identity. And it's not just a little effect, 5 times higher. And here we're talking about pregnancy-related mortality. So just think about that. Just think about that for a second. Having a baby is 5 times more dangerous for Black women in the United States than for white women. We're going to come back to this, but this is the type of thing, the type of outcome in the healthcare system that is directly tied to intersectional identities and how they interact with systemic injustice. So that's a bit on the negative side. Let's go towards the positive side of this. How are we going to do something about this? How are we going to make this happen? Just taking a second here to pause for questions as well. I see that somebody's got in the chat here a question, wondering if this number is even higher for Black women in lower socioeconomic groups. Absolutely the right question. I don't have the data in front of me for that. I can go back and take a look at the paper. The citation is there. Generally speaking, though, yes, socioeconomic category will also impact this. So you're seeing this exactly what I'm trying to lay a pathway towards. You add a factor and you add a factor and you add a factor. And instead of just strictly multiplying, you end up with more of an exponential challenge. So this is a big challenge. And I should say here in this particular example that I have focused on that external piece, so on the healthcare system itself. And these kinds of effects happen inside the education system as well. So what do we do? What do we do? So we have a lot of goals as health professional educators. We have a lot of goals. There's a lot of things that we're trying to do. That's part of the challenge of health professional education, is that we are looking to help people move along a lot of different paths at once. It's a complicated approach. So for today, 2 goals for us: to build an education system that empowers learners on their journey within the program and beyond as professionals. So we want to empower them while they're learning, and we want to give them a bigger step forward. We also want to empower learners to enact change as part of their professional practice via their professional identity formation. So often when we think about professional identity formation in health professions education, we tend to go towards the technical skills, the clinical skills, the ways in which this person will be a physician or a nurse or a social worker or any of these sorts of things. But what I want to argue today is that professional identity formation should also include this piece about really learning who you are as a person. And I think that if we do that, if we go for that piece, if we include this in professional identity formation, we can really start tackling both of these goals. And so that's what I want to argue today. And I'm going to talk about this word praxis here next. So here's a definition of practice. This is a praxis. This is an old word, excuse me. This goes a long way back to the ancient Greeks, in fact. But here's a definition of it from the education system. And that is from Paulo Freire, from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is not a new title. Many of you will be familiar with it. Is that praxis is defined here as reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. So 3 pieces there. We're going to reflect on what we're doing. We're going to act upon it with a very specific goal of transforming the world. Even if that's in a little small way, that's what we want to do. So critical reflection as an activity in the health professions is not really a new idea either, but I want to just make a connection here with that word critical. When we're talking about critical reflection, we're talking about thinking about some of those tenets of critical theory that we talked about before. So how do I myself as a person relate to what I'm doing, either what I'm learning or what I'm seeing in my professional practice? So it requires a practitioner to actively consider knowledge claims. not just sort of a surface level about what it is that we've just learned or what it is that we have just seen in our practice that we've met with a patient, but the potential for change by examining power relations, societal assumptions, individual biases around those knowledge claims. And that's our own biases and other biases too. Experiential knowledge is really important for this. So when we ask students, when we ask people to engage in critical reflection, we are asking them to use their personal experience. And I'm going to make a little bit of a controversial statement here where I'm going to say that other forms of learning are as important as scientific and technical knowledge in a critically reflective approach to practice. This is a little bit of a it's not something you hear every day when you're talking about health professions education, that we should value some of these personal experiences, some of these external forms of learning. How do we apply that when we're teaching basic science? Right? It's not the sort of thing you run into in your biochemistry class every day. But the argument I want to make is that you can find it there. You can find it in all kinds of places. And when we get towards the end, we'll talk about some ways in which you can engage this. But the idea is that folks will draw on their own personal situation in the world and relate that to the things that they're learning, the things that they're doing. And so by doing this way, I think we can make some change. It requires critical reflection on people's own identity, people's own positionality as they develop their professional identity. So as part of that, as part of becoming a doctor, as part of becoming a nurse, as part of becoming any health profession, you're developing that professional identity too. All right, I'm just going to pause for a second here as well. A couple of comments in the chat. Nicole has pointed out that for the data for the fact that I showed earlier suggests that it's regardless of socioeconomic status that these things happen. That's I have to go back and look at that data. That's probably true in that case, but it's worth thinking about. The question is worth asking about socioeconomic status. So I appreciate that being raised there. And we've also had somebody ask about the hidden curriculum. Would you like to elaborate on that, Cecil, about the hidden curriculum?
Well, I'm just wondering, when you speak to, how can we incorporate this into maybe certain courses that aren't maybe conducive to implementing some of these strategies sort of naturally? There's lots of ways as an educator. I know that, how I say things or how I meet my students in the classroom or even in the hallways, right? How that sort of helps them develop their professional identity maybe, or that role modeling piece that we have. So I'm wondering if that's what you're referring to when you talk about drawing on some of those personal experiences and putting them into the material, maybe not as curriculum or part of the outlines, but is that what you meant?
So I love that you've asked this question, because so those are exactly the things, but with the pitch that I have for you today is that the hidden curriculum is the only place we find those things, or one of the only places. We want that out of the hidden curriculum and into the explicit educational curriculum. So I really like that you've referenced that. This is a huge problem. I mean, the hidden curriculum, we could talk all day about the hidden curriculum in health professions education, but what I really want to do is pull this piece about who are you as a health educator out of the hidden curriculum and into the explicit part of our teaching. I don't, just to add to that, and I don't know a ton about hidden curriculum, certainly not my area of expertise, but it's normally referred to as like a negative connotation, right? And can that be flipped into like a positive connotation? Is that acceptable? I see what you're saying. It should be explicit and within the actual outline, but would focusing it to use it to our advantage be acceptable, I guess, or beneficial? That is my argument, 110%, that not only should it not be hidden, it should be an explicit and positive part of what we do with our learners every day. Okay. So we'll see if I get there. There's a challenge for me. Let me see if I get there, okay? Here's how I'm gonna start getting there. It's great when people provide you with lovely segue. This is one of my favorite quotations of all time. This is from Bell Hooks, who unfortunately we lost not too long ago, a revolutionary educator. This quotation is one that I return to day after day in my own practice, that teachers must be actively committed to a process of self-actualization that promotes their own well-being if they are to teach in a manner that empowers students. And so here is what I want to argue for all of us. And I think that the fact of us being here in this workshop today together is such a good sign of this already, that we all as educators need to participate in this as much as our students do. This is a precisely the opposite of a do as I say, not as I do approach to teaching. Okay, so this is where I want to go with this. We're going to do this, and we're going to figure out how to do this with our students. So here's where we're going to come to an activity. I'm going to explain what we do here before we have the recording turned off, so that folks who are...
I just wanted to interrupt you. In the chat, there is a comment there from Hannah's. Do you want me to read it, or?
Yeah, no, I see it there. Let me address it. Thank you very much. So the comment here is, speaking as an autistic former clinical student, keeping things in the hidden curriculum makes it almost impossible for different socially located folks to pick up expectations and form relationships. That's a really important comment. Thank you for that. That encapsulates the problem with the hidden curriculum really, really well. The very fact that we have skills and activities and relationship building approaches that we consider to be relevant for our students, for our trainees, named as hidden. I mean, imagine if we just take a minute to think about that, think about the wording. What is it that we're doing here? That provides all kinds of challenges for people. So I really appreciate that comment there, because we need to find ways to have everybody under the same umbrella with what we're doing, and introducing obstacles, introducing, mazes and barriers and challenges that are of this nature. It does so much damage. It's worse than nothing. And so not only do we need to move that needle back to the midpoint, we need to start going the other way so that these things aren't happening. And yes, thank you, Nicole, as well. The environment is not safe to bring the hidden curriculum forward for some of us who are from the equity deserving groups. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And that is where we need a lift, a big lift from everybody. We need to normalize this type of activity. We need to bring it forward. We need to highlight how we are doing this together. And I don't mean for 1 second to imply, I should address that a little bit more carefully, that this is just something we can just flip a switch on and do. Not everybody is safe. Agreed. What we're working on here as part of this type of activity is to slowly push a culture change, because ultimately this is a culture change that we're working towards here. Okay, it's not an overnight switch. It's a culture change. But from each and every one of us that can to start working towards this, I hope, too aspirational, possibly, that there are ways in which we can move this forward. So again, that's a challenge for me, Nicole, and I appreciate that. And let's see if we can get there a little bit with this. I'm happy to discuss that further as we go along. Anybody else before I move a little forward here? Really appreciate these comments, folks. Please keep them coming. All right, so I'm going to stop talking here in a second. We're going to get towards the activity portion of this. We're going to do two different things. We're going to do an activity where we're going to explore our own intersectionality a little bit. And then we're going to engage in a very small practice of critical reflection, just to think a little bit about how we might change our viewpoint somewhat by considering these different things. So what we're going to do, I'm going to have my colleague Kyla put in the chat a slide version of this, a PowerPoint version and an Acrobat version that you can draw and you can write on. I'm going to get you to fill in this little Venn diagram here with some different aspects of your own identity. So I've just thrown some straight up examples up there, but I am going to share my own afterwards. So just so that we're, again, this is not a do as I say, not as I do. I'm going to share mine with you after this. So I'll invite you to add some things into this if you like, to do that, and then to think about how different aspects of your identity inform your relationship with the world. And again, just a little bit of a thought activity for yourself. Also, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing, to think about how these different aspects of your identity might inform how you position yourself as a health professional educator, what your experience is in that realm. If you're not an educator yet, if you're at a different stage of your journey here, think about it for your own professional stage, wherever you're at. I'm going to give folks about 10 minutes to do this. So it's sort of a camera off activity. We're going to stop the recording as soon as we do that. And then when we come back, I'm going to share mine, and I'm going to invite folks, if they wish, to share some of what they've put on their Venn diagram. Only if you wish. The recording will remain off. But we're going to just talk through this a little bit about some of the ways in which we situate ourselves in the world. Does anybody have any questions about this activity? It'll be about 10 minutes and we'll come back together. There's perfect. Thanks. So what we want to do here, what I'm trying to convince you of is first of all, is the value of doing this for yourself as a health professions educator, as a health professions leader, and to encourage and invite you to model this type of thing in your health professions education practice. Again, fully recognizing the earlier comment about safety, but thinking about little ways in which each of us can turn that dial on the culture change. It starts with us. As trite as that sounds, it starts with us because we need to model this for our learners. Then we need to think about ways that we can incorporate this type of thing as a component of that professional identity formation piece for our trainees. So this isn't something that we do on the side. This isn't like a, we've talked about the hidden curriculum. It's not even that. It's not even that, oh, now today we're going to work on critical reflection. This is something that happens. It's part of everything we do, an explicit part, but it's worked in all over the place so that working on you, who you are as a learner, who you will be as a professional, is an explicit part of everything you do as you train. And so there are lots of ways of doing this. I'm happy to, there will be a Q&A afterwards, incidentally. So if folks want to stick around for some specific, very specific strategies and examples, I'm happy to discuss those. But generally speaking, writing, critically reflective writing, it's amazing how difficult that can be for students to do. It's amazing how insightful it can be for them to do. Simulations is a great place to do this. You incorporate it into the simulation itself, and then very specifically into the simulation debrief, that critically reflective piece around what has been seen, what has been learned. Community learning, experiential learning, these are all places where we can think about doing this. Again, it needs to be made explicit and it needs to be modeled by us. Don't ask them to go away and think critically. Work together as a group to engage in this praxis. And so I'm going to end there and just remind you again of these goals. What I think are our goals is to educate folks in a way that helps them while they're learning and helps them to become those kinds of professionals that we know they can be, to give them that empowerment to make change as they go forward. And that is all rooted in this aspect of professional identity formation that focuses specifically on who you are in relation to the rest of the world.